Welcome, quiet soul. You always hear what others miss. So tonight, you are the groom of the stool, the hand behind the throne, the keeper of both filth and secrets. People think power lives in golden halls and war rooms, but what if it actually sat in a quiet chamber beside a wooden box with a velvet lid smelling faintly of soap sweat, and something far older than royalty? And before we dive in, I'd love to know, did anything in this story strike a chord with you? Stir your curiosity, drop a comment below. Who knows, your thought might just become the little treasure the whole community will want to dig up. And hey, if you're enjoying this, don't forget to like, share or hit subscribe, because sometimes a single click can send 100 amazing stories rippling outward. Sometimes the dirtiest jobs leave the clearest legacy. Let's begin right where your name was still unknown, and a folded towel marked the start of your reign. You step into the Whitehall chamber just as the first sunlight strokes the mother-of-pearl inlays on the cold stone floor. The March air slides down your collar, carrying the scent of damp wood and cured meat from the royal kitchen still smouldering beneath their iron grates. In your hand, a letter sealed with red wax pressed with the royal crest. You have never been summoned to a formal banquet, never been introduced to the king. In court records, your name exists as little more than a faint stroke under the column labelled minor nobility. And yet here you are, standing outside the Chancellor's door, your name a voice dry as pressed parchment slices the air as you cross the threshold. Thomas Brackley of House Bolton, sir. You reply, fingers clutching the last clean handkerchief you own. He does not nod. Do not ask again. He simply pushes a small wooden box toward you. Inside, a square folded white cloth, a black leather-bound ledger, and a brass key cold to the touch. You've been chosen. For what, sir? To hold the king's seat. Seat, as in every sense of the word. You will serve as the groom of the stool. He doesn't raise an eyebrow, but the words brush your skin like a blade steeped in mint tea. You bow, lift the box. 1,000 questions crowd your mind, but none find breath. You wonder why the one who's never stepped foot in the reception hall, why not the boys groomed since youth inside noble academies? Why choose the boy with thin wrists and a record for defying instructors? Yet part of you begins to understand. Perhaps it is those very wrists, that quiet gaze, that surplus of silence and absence of ambition that made you exactly what the king desired most when seated. The corridor to the king's private chamber stretches long and windless. Wolf pelts line the walls, but it's the cold echo of bare soles on polished stone that tingles your spine. At the end stands a door of heavy oak, its brass handle worn smooth at the edge. You rest your hand on it, turn, step through. The room is hushed. Thick velvet curtains, oil lamps burning Syrian incense, a sweetness that clings heavy like oaths. At the centre, more regal than the throne itself, sits the close stool, lion-headed, draped in violet velvet, resting atop a pedestal of blackwood 1/2 foot high. You step forward, touch the rim of the stool, cold, smooth, sacred in its filth. Mind the left edge. It cracked after His Majesty fell once too many hard-boiled eggs. A voice behind you, warm amused. You turn. A courtier, lean frame eyes twinkling like mischief under candlelight. From now on you're the closest man to the king. He brushes your shoulder gently like passing on an heirloom, then vanishes down the hall. The first night unfolds like a silent rite. After the banquet you wait in the privy chamber, hands steady. A basin of warm water, fresh cloth on a silver tray. The king enters wordless. He removes his robe, unfastens his belt, lowers himself onto the stool with the calm of a man reading scripture. Your name. His voice is even eyes, unfazed. Thomas, your majesty. Ever wiped anyone before? No, your majesty. Then I'm your first. You nod. Dip the cloth. Your hand meets his back. His skin is warm, damp. The muscles flinch slightly as you reach the final vertebra. A quiet blend of wine and old wood fills your nose. There is no sound except breath leaving his chest. The moment holds the tenderness of wiping a weary father, and the charge of tending to the live engine of a restless empire. He rises, turns, eyes meet yours. They neither prove nor pardon. You will keep this secret, won't you? Before you can answer, he's gone, leaving behind the seat still warm, and the scent of sovereignty not yet faded. You open the black leather ledger, dip the quill in blue ink. Write your first line, first day. Soft cushion, heavy waist, and power begins where eyes refuse to look. You close the book, gaze at the candle, its wax nearly gone. You never imagined you would witness hours like these. Yet after the first wipe, you understand there is no return. From now on, you don't simply cleanse for the king. You cleanse what the crown cannot afford to leave behind. And you, yes, you are the only one who sees it all and still lives to wipe again. You moved into a small room tucked between the stillest stone walls of the palace, the place where those who served the throne came to pause. There was no bed, only a low wooden stool, a piece of sheepskin spread on the floor, and a silver bell tied with red thread. No wind reached this far. The only light came through the stained glass candlelight replaced every 2 hours. No one walked past your door. No one asked what you ate. No one told you what to do. They placed you there like a footstone beneath the throne, and waited to see whether you could stay balanced between the scent of incense and the things slowly leaking from the soul of the monarchy itself. You didn't sleep that first night. Your eyes stayed open until morning fixed on the tiny bell. Each time it rang, whether at the second or fourth watch, you rose, wiped your hands on your tunic and stepped into the privy chamber. At first it seemed random, but after just 3 days you began to read the rhythm. After grand banquets the bell rang around the third watch. The stool yielded a thick waste murky with a scent that lingered like an uninvited memory. When guests came from the southern counties the bell rang earlier, but the scent carried notes of fermented grapes, sour apple peels, and something dangerously close to poison. You began to write everything down. In your mind a system took form: blue ink for the days the king smiled, red for the days he cursed, black for the days nothing came out. One grey morning, heavy with dew, the bell rang. You opened the door and stepped in. The king already sat on the close stool, a robe resting loosely on his shoulders. Thomas, he said, as you knelt, his voice smooth as beeswax sealed over an old wineglass. Anne met with Norfolk again last night. Your hand dipped the cloth into warm water and paused. His shoes still held dirt from the back garden. Only one man can get in that way. You carefully wiped his right side. The warmth of his skin mingled with a scent hard to name, half musk, half calculation. The king lifted slightly as if granting you access to a more delicate place. He'll be sent to Ireland, he continued, his voice steady as the final line of a judgment. You nodded. In your mind, Norfolk was already on the western shore, lashed by sea winds, tripping over mud and stones among red-haired women who had never learned to bow. That night you wrote it down in your ledger. Anne, Norfolk, Ireland, garden soil, Her Majesty's most persuasive witness. Weeks passed. Servants began to glance at you with wary eyes. Perhaps because you often walked near the royal correspondence room. Perhaps because you never smiled when addressed by your name without a title. You didn't need their approval. You held something none of them could touch: the king's bowel schedule, the twitch of his brow, when straining, even the days when he shifted 3 times and still produced nothing. Once you entered the chamber and found a crumpled paper in the basin, you unfolded it. It read, "Cabinet list tomorrow afternoon." At the bottom, one name had been crossed out twice in violet ink. 3 days later, that name disappeared from court entirely. You kept the paper, folded it into quarters, pressed it into the edge of your ledger where you recorded the lines meant for no other eyes. One afternoon, while changing the water in the chamber, the king entered earlier than usual. He didn't sit. He crossed his arms and watched you kneel by the basin. "Thomas," he said, "do you know how much I pay each man each month?" You shook your head. "Then from now on you will. I want you to keep the privy purse. You write, you remember, and you speak nothing." You looked up. Water spilled from the rim of the basin, soaking the hem of your trousers. The king took no notice. "Why me?" you asked. Your voice sounded drier than the embers in the royal stove. "Because you're the only one who wipes me when I am weakest." You bowed. Not to agree, but because in his eyes you saw yourself behind a silvered mirror where reflection meant not a face but a station. One without a title, without a name, but with the key. That night you wrote, "I once held the cloth. Now I hold the coffer," and on the margin in blue ink you drew a little emblem, a chamber pot with wings. A quiet joke, yet also a mark. Power does not rise. Power flows downward, and you're the last one who gathers it all. The first hour of your day began before the sun stirred. You knocked on the comptroller's door, received a stack of sealed letters, and stepped into the private chamber where only one person was permitted to stand beside the king. You. The king opened his eyes. He lifted 2 fingers ever so slightly as if signalling a sonata you had long since memorized. You prepared silk towels, warm water, a vial of mint oil, and the small note you wrote the night before. Today ask His Majesty about the Pope's response to the Treaty of Calais. By the third hour you stood in the shadows of a cabinet meeting. They mistook you for a servant. Yet you were the one who quietly struck off 2 noblemen from that evening's royal supper, because the day before they had feasted too heavily, while the king suffered indigestion. A breach of bodily diplomacy only you could detect. Do you think I should let him live? The king once asked mid-defecation moments after a disorderly court session. You gave no answer. You simply switched the rinse bottle from lavender to cedarwood, your wordless suggestion for something colder, something sharper. By the 6th hour you were auditing the secret inventory, not of silver or gold, but of the privy purse discreet disbursements, covert gifts, moonlit letters sealed in gold wax. Only you knew the king had paid handsomely to reclaim a plot of land where an ancient well stood. Rumour claimed it led through unseen passages to the queen's private quarters. Do you think I'm too suspicious? He once asked in the dark. You answered with something soft, almost a breath. Better many eyes than blind trust. At the 8th hour, a newly promoted courtier slipped you a rolled parchment and an offer of friendship. You didn't open it. You placed it on the reserve stool beside the porcelain basin. When the king arrived and saw it resting half off the edge, he frowned. He didn't ask who had left it. He only said, "Things that fall too easily tend to betray just as easily." By the 9th hour you washed your hands before the bronze mirror where your reflection stretched long and warped. Sometimes you wonder who you are in this glass. The shadow, the man, or merely a residue. You dined alone in the small room adjacent to the royal toilet. On your table sat a bowl of porridge and an envelope. Inside the names of upcoming foreign delegations. You underlined the ones from lands where paper still bore Confucius's name. You knew these visitors brought a form of hygiene built on awe and dread. When I sit, no one stands above me, except you the king once let slip. You bowed. But your hand still held the ledger, because nothing reveals a man more clearly than when he is bare and in need of help. You once thought you were merely a cleaner, but by the 9th hour you saw it plainly. You had become the internal map of power, the cartographer of suspicion, the guardian of flesh to keep it from exposing the mind. Is there any other role in the world that allows you to witness every political manoeuvre, every symptom of illness, every tonal shift through a space no wider than the span of a stool? And so, it was one night leafing through an old Roman manuscript that you found a line penned centuries ago. The cleanest place is not one without filth, but one that knows when silence must endure. You smiled. You closed your book, ink still wet on your fingers. Yet in your mind a thought had already sunk in deep. I've spent so long wiping for one man, but who wipes for a whole civilization? You sat still beneath the oil lamp watching your shadow stretch across the lime-washed wall. It bent, but somehow it bore the perfect shape of a man kneeling cloth in hand, eyes fixed on something that existed nowhere in the room. You once believed that paper served only 2 purposes, writing and wiping. But after handling the privy purse ledger, doubt crept in. Black ink marked expenditures. Red ink logged other transactions. Green ink was reserved for one purpose alone, to distract the eyes of anyone reading after you, and you used all 3. Then you wiped. Each time you wiped, you wondered if these pages were ever used in place of silk towels. Would anyone still dare to open them? One late spring evening, just after a court banquet dissolved into smoke and song, you stepped into the courtyard, passing by the discreet side door of the sealed royal library. A breeze stirred. The moon waned. The door stood unlatched. No guards. No candlelight. Sometimes such moments arrive not to invite, but to test your nerves. You placed a hand on the iron latch and gently pushed inward. A scent of dust mixed with aged leather and oak swept into your nostrils like the low note of a forgotten symphony. You stepped lightly between shelves, your fingertips grazing the spines, treatises on diplomacy, banquet menus, from past reigns, lists of tributes from Persia. Then, on the topmost tier, you found a thick volume with a snakeskin spine, its title embossed in fading silver chronicles of Roman hygiene. You pulled it down, sat on a faded rug the colour of ash, and opened to the first page. The ancient Romans used a stick with a sea sponge affixed at its tip to cleanse after defecation, called the tersorium, shared among all, soaked in vinegar brine, placed in a wooden basin near the floor. You read silently, your lips drying with each word. The further you went, the smaller the letters became. Between 2 printed pages, a handwritten note appeared. A slave once ended his life, by forcing the entire tessorium down his throat. Died in a public latrine, the only place free from supervision. You closed the book. Something churned inside. Amid all the marble and empire that stick remained. Shared. Rinsed with vinegar, but never enough to cleanse despair. You clutched the book to your chest, not for knowledge, but for the eerie sense that you had touched something that reached beyond the toilet. Back in your room, you opened your familiar black notebook. Wrote tessorium. Shared. A death cleaner than vinegar. The next morning you shared the story with the man who maintained the incense in the royal lavatory. He was once a footman during the king's father's reign. The Chinese were different, he murmured over tea, the steam tracing his wrinkles. They used paper, scented. But the paper bore writings of sages, so some preferred to abstain rather than use it for the sake of dignity. You listened and felt the eastern wind ghost past your neck. Paper with fragrance, yet shame clung tighter than perfume. It was a kind of honour, yet also self-inflicted penance. In China, they feared defiling philosophy more than they feared living unclean. That night you opened a file on a Song Dynasty envoy who had visited 6 winters ago. One entry read, "Imperial toilet paper stored in sandalwood boxes perfumed with licorice inscribed with Tang poetry, distributed only to court ladies and ministers." Your pen froze at the phrase inscribed with Tang poetry. It sounded soft, but it cut like a blade. You set your pen down and wrote, "In China, paper is a face. In England, paper is a mask." A week later, you overheard a conversation behind a tapestry. 2 nobles whispered, "Why does the king insist on fresh towels before every cabinet meeting?" The other replied, "Because he wants to be sure the one who wipes knows what deserves to be erased and what must remain." You didn't enter. You stood still, spine pressed against the cold stone wall, your heartbeat thumping through silk. That night sleep eluded you. You began to press and dry each piece of paper you had used for wiping. You labelled them one by one. Tuesday banquet, after the Persian envoy's audience. Winter solstice ritual. King lingered longer than usual. Christmas morning. Distinct scent of mint. You realised you were rewriting history with what others discarded. Each sheet you had once folded and flushed away had become a secret chapter, absent from chronicles. But enough more than enough for someone one day to unfold and discover that courts are built not just from stone and statutes, but from what was quietly wiped away. You began using red ink for these annotations, because red ink is never read aloud. You scribbled on thin paper, folded it tight, and hid it in the bottom of the linen box. Each night you added one more. Now tell me what you believe paper is for wiping, or for capturing the very thing most try to hide. A pen may speak more truth than a sword. But a stained sheet carries sharper proof, and you, the one who wipes, have become the one who remembers. You glance around. The room remains silent, but you know those soiled papers whispered to each other in the dark, about all that has been erased, and about the one soul still quietly recording. You once believed you had learned enough to read the language of silence, but one whisper escaped at the wrong time with the wrong cadence and never made it into the ledger. One summer night, after a feast that lingered until the 3rd watch, the king sat on the close stool longer than usual. You knelt beside him, wiping the folds of his robe, catching the scent of wine trapped in the threads of silk like a sigh left unfinished. "I'm afraid," he said, eyes gazing into the void between 2 brocade curtains. "I'm afraid I can no longer control myself." Your hand paused mid-wipe. That sentence wasn't about the odour, or the stomach cramps. It was a crack in the surface. And you, the one who wipes, felt a chill crawl up your spine. That night you folded the towels earlier than usual. You cleaned the brass basin slower than usual, and for the first time since entering the palace you wrote nothing in the ledger. Because some words once written become betrayal, and once withheld becomes a burden. 3 days later you asked to step down. You knelt before the king without waiting to be summoned. "I gave you the privy purse," he said. His tone held no accusation, no anger. "And now you return it with silence," you replied. "It is because of silence that I must leave." He nodded, then turned his face away, letting the lamplight fall upon the creases of his nape, creases you had never noticed until then. You left the palace at dawn, returned to the village where rice fields followed the seasons, where the well water had never heard of court scandals, where no one knew which part of the body-scented paper was meant to wipe. You lived in a thatched hut, growing vegetables, tending chickens, and writing your journal in charcoal. Each morning you sat and watched sunlight crawl across the mud ledge quietly, like a man polishing the reflection of the past. When villagers asked what you did in the palace, you answered, "I guarded a door." They nodded. Gatekeepers rarely get pulled into great affairs, but power never calls you by name, it knocks in residue. A month later, on a gusty evening while you were chopping wood at the doorstep, a black-painted carriage stopped at your gate. No hoofbeats, no voices, only one object was placed on the stone step. You looked. A chair. Not just any chair. The close-stool purple velvet black ebony frame, silver feet, still bearing the scratches you used to polish every week. Etched into the lid in golden studs it read, "I no longer trust who wipes for me." You stood there night wind, licking your neck like a dull blade tracing a familiar scar. The carriage rolled away, leaving no tracks. The chair stayed. Silent, but loud enough to remind you, when the throne feels soiled, it calls for the one who once knew how to cleanse it. You returned to court the next day. The gates stood open. Your old room still held warmth, now guarded by 2 soldiers. They flanked the toilet, not the throne. As if the royal bodyguard now watched over the basin you once scrubbed. The king met you in the sealed library. He didn't sit. Neither did you. Both stood face to face, surrounded by books that had quietly survived every regime change. "The privy purse has been breached," he said. A transfer went into the Duke of Kent's private account. Forged signature. You asked, "What do you want me to do?" You were the last person to touch the money I believed was still clean. You bowed your head. In that moment you knew you were no longer the one who held the towel. You were the one holding the line between power and collapse. A curtain, a layer of paint, a scrap of cloth. Small things, but enough to cover an empire cracking at the seams. That night you returned to your room, reopened the worn ledger and wrote in red ink. The one who cleans is never truly free. But when the filth flows, words settle in the water. You laid down your pen, closed the book and leaned against the wall, watching the oil lamp flicker in rhythm with your heartbeat. You had fled, but never escaped. Because those who wipe stains always carry their scent, and the throne, once it seeps into your fingertips, doesn't wash off with soap. Only with blood. What crossed your mind then as you stood again in that golden palace, and yet longed for the scent of village soil? Perhaps everyone who ever wished for a king must spend the rest of their life wiping memories of it. You exhaled, then stepped into the privy chamber. Towels ready, water warm. The king was already seated. No words were exchanged. But in that silence you understood he had been waiting since the moment your hand touched the village latch. And so you returned. Not because the throne needed you, but because you alone remembered this truth: he who wipes rules. You once thought that wiping was just a technical gesture. Each morning unfold the towel, clean thoroughly, fold it back, serve the king, bow your head. But over time, through every wipe, you began to see it excrement remembers. It holds what the body tried to swallow and expels what the conscience failed to deny, especially royal excrement. You think shit is filth? Your voice echoed across the narrow chamber where your apprentice was folding a towel as if it were a royal decree. He chuckled, cheeks flushed, still untouched by the scent of a failed banquet, or an execution pending royal approval. You placed your hand on his shoulder, light as advice, but really a warning. When the king smiles while relieving himself, that's when he's already chosen who will die. The boy looked up. You mean His Majesty makes decisions while he's seated? You nodded. Some things don't need repeating. You told an old story, your voice simmering like a kettle pulled from the flame. There was once a bout of diarrhea 3 days straight. The entire court held its breath. On the 4th morning, as he leaned forward, he turned to me and said, "I feel lighter now. Time to be gentle." 3 noblemen were executed that afternoon. Their blood spread across the stone floor thinner than what he had just passed. You said no more. Just wiped the desk, set down the incense burner and instructed, "From now on, don't laugh in this room. Smiles here usually come with the scent of death." Then you taught him how to wipe, not the folding of towels, but how to read the stool. Smell carefully on the first pass. If it's strong yet mellow, he'll pardon someone. If sour and dark, an oath has just been swallowed. If loose but cold, a secret council has taken place inside his gut. You lectured like a physician, though all you ever did was what everyone else refused. But you had smelled enough, wiped enough, heard enough to know the throne always leaves a mark and the stool is the rawest copy of power. You shared another tale. A noble once came to you at midnight. He offered a jade stone wrapped in brocade, voice trembling. "Please don't clean it completely. Leave a trace, just a faint scent." So the royal physician believes His Majesty is gravely ill. You remembered wrapping the jade, tucking it into a coal jar, and returning nothing but an empty stare. Beneath the throne everyone bows, but only you bowed to clean. Another time, while writing your log, a stranger slipped past the guards and handed you a quiet purse. No words. Inside a few silver coins and a slip of paper, "Help me become king. Just wipe wrong once." You laughed. The kind of laugh only a toilet keeper knows, warped cold trailing off like half-flushed water. You didn't respond, but the next day you switched clothes. No more silk towels, just coarse paper, and you wiped thoroughly. So much so that the king asked, "Feels a bit raw today." You bowed, said nothing. The apprentice asked, "Why didn't you report him? He tried to bribe you." You answered, "He didn't buy me. But he did teach me what's scariest in this palace isn't the blade, it's the paper." He looked puzzled. You brought your hand to your nose, mimed a sniff. And the scent. In the end, you handed him the ledger, the book you'd written through 3 kings, 7 guard captains, and over 10,000 wipes. Written in red ink, the colour of spilled blood, of unspoken words, and of truths yet unconfirmed. On the final page you wrote, "History need not know who I am, but I know who did what at the very moment they released everything they had forced down, and I wiped. Not out of loyalty, not out of spite, but because shit never lies." You closed the book, gave it to him, watched him bow awkwardly but sincerely. You knew that from tomorrow onward those sighs would no longer come from your mouth, but the throne would still be served, and the scent still present. You turned, walked out of the perfume chamber, the place where you had stood for a lifetime, quiet as wind behind the curtain. Do you think you've escaped? Or do you still feel it just as you once did, the stains still lingering? On the sleeve of your apprentice, you sat on the marble bench inside a glass-walled room, chilled like a September dawn. A slant of golden light stretched above your head, grazing the old brass plaque etched with a single line, "The Royal Close Stool, circa 1533. Beyond the glass, the ancient throne stood still, its seat curved inward, hollowed by the weight of sovereign buttocks, day after day, year after year, pressed down not just by digestion, but by politics, grief, fear, and too much burgundy from last night's banquet. You looked closely. In the seams of the oak, faint streaks still lingered, not from the king's hand, but from yours. This was the only place a museum guide's voice whispered behind you where the king was ever completely honest. She spoke gently, as if afraid her voice might scratch the silence of the exhibit, and the only person who ever witnessed it was him. You turned. Her eyes landed on yours with a flicker of curiosity, as if you seemed too ordinary to have once held a role so intimate, so unspeakably powerful. She had never lived in your time, never stayed awake at 3 a.m. to decode a tyrant's groan, never weighed the timing of an execution by the rhythm of laboured breaths. Still you nodded. He had such power, she added, trying to smile, that sometimes a misfolded towel could mean a missing minister. Some researchers now say, she added with a soft chuckle, that it wasn't the throne that governed the court, it was the toilet. You stepped closer to the glass, let your fingers trace its cold surface, slowly outlining the silhouette of the ancient seat. In your mind, the old pages rustled open. Red-inked records linked diarrhea to palace purges, bloating to backroom deals, indigestion to the end of dynasties. They say modern toilets are cleaner, smarter, more civilized. Seats heated, nozzles, automatic perfumes preloaded to erase discomfort. But you know better. All of it, vanilla mist, leather cushions, porcelain glaze, is just scented denial. Denial of what the body really says when it speaks through waste. You've lived long enough to see toilet paper embossed with flowers, seen the rich monogram their wipes, watching politicians print the faces of their enemies on cardboard cores. What once was filth now parades as fashion as theatre. But you know, no matter the silk wrap or linen finish, what it wipes remains the same, what people most desperately wish to hide. You know, the guide whispered again, voice fading. Some scholars say that chair is a symbol of truth, stripped bare. Because whether you're a king or a beggar, you leave all your mask behind when you sit down. You turned away, smiling faintly. She was right. Almost. But what made that chair terrifying was never who sat on it. It was who knelt behind it, who wiped it, who saw everything and said nothing. You once served 3 kings, saw the emptiness behind their gleaming eyes, smelled loneliness leaking from their pores. You watched one monarch break into tears because his stool turned red, convinced he was dying. And you watched a usurper laugh when told the king hadn't moved his bowels in 3 days. History remembers who gave orders. It never records the groans of a bloated belly. But you remember. You remember every breath, every churn of the gut, every trembling night when he whispered, "If my shit's soft today, I'll sign the peace treaty tomorrow." You know the toilet is the only place where a person emerges from beneath their position, just like you did, stripped of titles, freed from the scent of power. All that remained was a man guarding a chair, yet the only one who ever truly saw where the line stood between the man and the monarch. The guide turned away, the crowd drifted on, it was just you now, and the chair. The museum lights flickered once. Then I went out completely. The room fell into a soft green dusk lit only by the ghost glow of city lights bleeding through the tall windows. They say you died long ago, that your grave lies in the public cemetery nameless unattended. But in this room, when the lights go dark, some claim they see the faint outline of a leather-bound ledger resting on the seat, and a hand, quiet, steady, resting gently on the handle. You ask me if history remembers you. I'm not sure, but the chair does.